Every preacher's son carries two things: the weight of his father's faith and the question of what happens when that faith breaks. For John Wesley Hardin, the breaking came early, came hard, and came with a body count that the state of Texas spent 20 years trying to stop adding to. By the time he was 25 years old, he had killed more men than most soldiers see fall in a lifetime of war. Not in a single battle, not in some desperate last stand. One at a time, face to face, in saloons and on dirt roads, and in the narrow hallways of boarding houses, over cards and over cattle, and over the sound of a man sleeping too loudly in the next room. That last one is not a figure of speech. John Wesley Hardin actually killed a man for snoring. He walked down a hallway in the dark, pushed open a door, and shot a stranger in his bed because the noise was keeping him awake. Then he climbed out a window and rode off into the Texas night, and he did not lose a single hour of sleep over it. That story alone tells you something about who this man was. But it does not tell you everything, because the full story of John Wesley Hardin is not simply the story of a killer. It is the story of a particular kind of American violence, the kind that gets romanticized into legend because the country that produced it cannot quite decide whether to be ashamed or proud. It is the story of what the Civil War did to a generation of Southern boys who grew up in its shadow, learning that the winners got to write the rules and the losers got to carry guns and call it pride. It is the story of a legal system so broken that a man could kill dozens of people and spend most of his adult life free. And it is, underneath all of it, the story of a preacher's son who never stopped believing, even when surrounded by bodies, that he was the righteous one. So let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to Texas in the years when the ground was still soaked with the blood of the war, and a boy with his grandfather's name was just starting to understand what he was capable of. Before we get into all of this, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. This channel goes deep into the parts of history that the textbooks gloss over, the real stories behind the legends, the darkness underneath the myth. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means you will not miss what is coming next. Now, let us talk about John Wesley Hardin. John Wesley Hardin was born on May 26, 1853, in Bonham, Texas. He was named for the founder of Methodism, the English preacher John Wesley, which tells you immediately what his father was hoping for. His father, James Gibson Hardin, was a circuit-riding Methodist preacher, a man who traveled across the raw landscape of antebellum Texas carrying the gospel on horseback. He was also, by most accounts, a decent and sincere man who genuinely believed in what he preached. He believed in forgiveness. He believed in the power of Scripture to reshape a man's nature. He had no way of knowing that the boy he named after a great man of peace would grow up to become the most feared gunfighter in the history of the American Southwest. The family moved frequently, as preacher families did, following the circuit across East Texas. John grew up in a world of camp meetings and Bible verses and long dusty rides between small settlements. He was, by his own account in the autobiography he later dictated from prison, a smart and eager child. He learned to read early. He liked mathematics. He was also, from a very young age, someone who could not stand to be challenged. Not physically, not verbally, not in any form. His father's faith taught him that all men were equal before God. The world he was growing up in taught him something different. It taught him that in Texas, in the years just before and during the Civil War, a white Southern man's honor was the closest thing to sacred that existed, and that defending it was not just a right, but a duty. Those two lessons, the preacher's gospel of equality and the Southern code of honor, were always going to be in tension inside John Wesley Hardin. The code won. It won completely and permanently, and it started winning very early. He was 15 years old the first time he killed a man. The year was 1868. The Civil War had been over for 3 years, but in Texas, the aftermath was still raw and bleeding. The state was under Reconstruction, which meant it was governed by a combination of federal troops, Republican administrators, and the newly formed Texas State Police, an organization that included black officers and that the white Southern population of Texas despised with a ferocity that went beyond ordinary political opposition. For a boy like John Hardin, raised in a deeply Confederate household, Reconstruction was not a policy. It was an occupation. The men enforcing it were not lawmen. They were enemies. This matters because it shapes the context of his first killing. The man he killed was a formerly enslaved man named Mage, whose last name history has not preserved. Mage and Hardin had a physical confrontation during a wrestling match, and Mage, by Hardin's account, threatened to kill him. A few days later, Mage approached Hardin on a road. Hardin said Mage attacked him. Hardin drew his pistol and shot him. Mage died from the wounds. And here is the part that set the trajectory for everything that followed. Hardin did not turn himself in. He ran. And when he ran, he was not running from justice in any straightforward sense. He was running from the specific brand of Reconstruction justice that, in his mind, would never treat a Southern white boy fairly in the killing of a black man. He may have been right about that in a horrible and twisted way, because Reconstruction justice was itself uneven and contested. But the logic he developed in that moment, the logic that said the law was his enemy and his gun was his only reliable protection, was the logic he would live by for the next 15 years. And it would kill a great many people. He did not stay hidden for long. He emerged, moved around, and killed again. Within the next 2 years, he killed at least 6 more men, a number that historians consider conservative. These were soldiers sent to arrest him, lawmen who got in his way, men who challenged him in circumstances that, by any modern standard, did not warrant lethal force. But John Hardin did not operate by modern standards. He operated by a code that said a threat to his person or his dignity was a death sentence for the person making it. He was fast. He was accurate. He was cool under pressure in a way that unsettled even experienced gunfighters. And he was, at this stage of his life, almost completely fearless, which in a young man with a pistol is perhaps the most dangerous quality in the world. He also began acquiring a reputation, which in the world of the frontier served both as protection and as a magnet for trouble. Men knew his name. Some of them stayed clear. Others, drawn by whatever combination of pride and poor judgment makes men challenge dangerous strangers, sought him out. A few of those encounters ended without violence. Many did not. One of the most often repeated stories from this period involves an encounter with Wild Bill Hickok, the famous lawman and gunfighter who was Marshal of Abilene, Kansas in 1871. Hardin was in Abilene that year, driving cattle up from Texas as part of the cattle drives that were beginning to reshape the economy of the Southwest. Hickok and Hardin met, and the details of what exactly happened vary depending on whose account you trust, but both men apparently recognized in each other something that made open conflict inadvisable. Whether all of it is true is uncertain. What is certain is that both men left Abilene alive, which was something of an achievement given the personalities involved. But before Abilene, there was the Snoring. In January of 1871, Hardin was staying at a hotel in Texas, and in the next room was a man whose name was later recorded as simply a traveler, never fully identified. The man snored. Hardin, by his own account, tried to ignore it, tried banging on the wall, could not sleep. And so, in the methodology that defined his entire approach to any irritant in his environment, he went to the source and eliminated it. He walked to the man's room, pushed open the door, fired his pistol into the sleeping figure, and left. The killing took place in the dark. The man who died almost certainly never knew what was happening to him. He was not a threat. He was not an enemy. He was not someone who had wronged Hardin in any meaningful sense. He simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time and made the wrong noise. And Hardin killed him with the same casual efficiency that another man might use to close a window. This is the killing that, more than any other, strips away any romantic coating from the Hardin legend. Because there is no way to frame it as self-defense. There is no way to frame it as honor. There is no code, Southern or otherwise, that required the killing of strangers for nocturnal noise. It was murder. Simple, thoughtless, utterly revealing murder. And the fact that Hardin included it in his own autobiography without apparent shame, describing it as a reasonable response to an intolerable situation, tells you everything about how he processed violence. It was just something he did. Like a man describing why he decided to take a different road to work. His career continued. The Sutton-Taylor feud was another chapter. This was a long-running conflict in DeWitt County, Texas, between two factions whose origins were tangled in Reconstruction politics and old grievances and cattle disputes, and the specific Texas talent for turning disagreements into wars. Hardin aligned himself with the Taylor side partly through family connections and partly through the natural gravitational pull of any conflict that let him shoot at people he considered enemies. He killed several men connected to the Sutton faction, and in doing so, embedded himself deeper in the web of violence and counter-violence that would eventually make his continued freedom impossible to maintain. One of the darkest episodes of the feud years came in 1874 in the town of Comanche, Texas, on his 21st birthday. It was May 26th, and Hardin was celebrating at a racetrack and a saloon, and he was drinking, which was not his best condition for making careful decisions. A deputy sheriff named Charles Webb arrived from Brown County. What exactly happened next is disputed, but the end result is not. Webb ended up dead with Hardin's bullet in him, and two of Hardin's friends shot Webb as well for good measure. The response from the state was immediate and brutal, not toward Hardin himself, who managed to escape, toward his family. His brother Joe Hardin was captured and lynched by a mob. Two of his cousins were killed. The message was clear. The state of Texas had decided that tolerance for John Wesley Hardin was over, and that the people connected to him were acceptable casualties in the effort to end his run. Hardin fled. He headed east, across the Mississippi, into Alabama, and then Florida, traveling under assumed names, trying to become invisible. He got married during this period to a woman named Jane Bowen, whom he had known back in Texas. He had children. He tried, in some limited and unconvincing way, to be something other than what he was. But the violence was not separate from him. It was him. He could put on a new name, he could move to a new state, he could learn to speak more carefully around strangers. The violence stayed. Florida was where the law finally caught up. A ranger named John Armstrong tracked him there to a train traveling through Pensacola in July of 1877. Armstrong boarded the train with other officers. There was a confrontation. A young man traveling with Hardin, a 17-year-old named Jim Mann, drew his gun and was shot dead immediately. Hardin, according to the accounts, reached for his own pistol and got it caught in his suspenders, a detail so mundane and so undignified that it seems almost designed by history to deflate the legend. He was clubbed unconscious with a pistol before he could free his weapon. John Wesley Hardin was captured not in a blaze of glory, but with his gun stuck in his own clothing, on a train, unconscious on the floor. He was brought back to Texas in chains. The trial was in Comanche for the killing of Charles Webb. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. He was 24 years old. He entered prison in 1878. The man who walked through those gates was arguably one of the most violent humans in the post-Civil War South, a man who had killed somewhere between 20 and 40 people, depending on which count you accept. A man who had spent his entire adult life in motion, sleeping in a different place almost every night, living by the speed of his draw and the coldness of his nerve. And now he was going to sit still for 25 years. Prison changed him. That is the simple version, and like most simple versions of complex things, it is both true and misleading. He spent the early years of his sentence the way you would expect. He tested the limits. He was involved in at least one escape attempt. He was difficult and dangerous and made clear to anyone who managed him that he had not entirely surrendered the man he used to be. But something shifted in the middle years. He started reading seriously, which he had always been capable of but had never prioritized over shooting people. He read law, he read philosophy, he read history. He began to study for the Texas bar examination with a seriousness that surprised the people around him. He wrote letters, many letters, to his wife Jane, long and earnest and full of a kind of tenderness that sits awkwardly alongside everything else we know about him. And he began working on the autobiography that would eventually be published after his death, the document in which he described the years of killing and running with a calm and occasionally self-justifying clarity that remains one of the most unsettling primary sources in the history of American violence. Because throughout the autobiography, Hardin is always the reasonable one. He never started anything. He only finished things that other people started. Every man he ever killed either came at him first or was planning to. The logic is internally consistent and externally insane, but it was absolutely sincere. He believed it completely. He had built his entire identity around the idea that John Wesley Hardin was a man who responded to threats, not a man who created them. The sleeping man in the hotel room does not quite fit that narrative, and Hardin's accounting of it in the autobiography is brief and somewhat evasive for the only time in the entire document. Even he seemed to understand, on some level, that one did not fit the framework. His wife Jane died in 1892 while he was still in prison. She had been faithful to him across the years of his incarceration, raising their children, waiting. Her death hit him hard. She represented the part of him that had wanted to be something other than what he was. With her gone, there was less reason to be that other thing. He was released from prison in 1894, having served 15 years of his 25-year sentence, his time reduced for good behavior and for the legal work he had done within the prison, helping other inmates with their cases. He was given a pardon by the governor of Texas. He walked out of Huntsville at 41 years old, a qualified lawyer, a published author in waiting, a man whose legend had grown considerably in the years he had been locked away, and a man who was now, in every practical sense, out of place in the world he had returned to. He passed the bar examination and set up a legal practice in Gonzales, Texas. He remarried, briefly and disastrously, to a woman named Callie Lewis, who was 15 years old when they married. That marriage lasted approximately 2 weeks before she left him and returned to her family. He moved to El Paso, drawn by a case involving a man named Kilpatrick, and by El Paso itself, which was a town that still had enough of the old frontier character that a man like Hardin could find some purchase there. He practiced law. He drank. He gambled. He began keeping company with a woman named Beulah Morose, whose husband Martin Morose was a cattle rustler involved in legal trouble that Hardin was nominally helping to resolve. The resolution that Hardin appears to have participated in was less legal than terminal. Martin Morose was killed in June of 1895, and Hardin was widely suspected of involvement, though nothing was ever formally proved. El Paso was not impressed by John Wesley Hardin. The lawmen there, particularly a constable named John Selman, did not share the frontier reverence for his reputation. Selman was himself a violent and morally flexible man, which perhaps made him immune to the awe that Hardin's name was supposed to generate. The two men circled each other with the specific wariness of people who are each used to being the most dangerous thing in the room and have now encountered a complication. On the night of August 19, 1895, John Wesley Hardin was in the Acme Saloon in El Paso. He was rolling dice at the bar. He had his back to the door, which was uncharacteristic, which some people take as evidence that he had been drinking heavily and had lowered his guard. John Selman walked into the saloon. What was said, if anything, before the shooting is disputed. What is not disputed is that Selman shot Hardin in the back of the head. One shot from behind while Hardin was looking at the bar. He fell. Selman fired 2 more shots into the body as it hit the floor. John Wesley Hardin died in the Acme Saloon without drawing his weapon, without seeing it coming, shot from behind like any man who has made too many enemies and finally runs out of places to stand. He was 42 years old. He died the way a large number of the men he had killed had died, without warning, without a fair chance, without the drama the legend demands. Selman was arrested and tried for the killing he claimed self-defense, which in El Paso in 1895 was a claim you could make about almost any shooting and get a sympathetic hearing. The first trial ended in a hung jury. Before the second trial could begin, Selman himself was shot and killed in an alley by a lawman named George Scarborough over a dispute about money. And with that, the circle closed. The autobiography was published in 1896, 1 year after his death. His son helped arrange the publication. The book presented Hardin's own version of his life, and it became one of the foundational texts in the American mythology of the gunfighter. Because the book is, whatever else it is, compulsively readable. Hardin could write. He had a storyteller's instinct for pacing and detail and the selection of the moment that makes everything else click into place. He could also, quite effortlessly, describe murder in the same tone you would use to describe a business transaction, which is disturbing in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore once you notice it. The book shaped how the public thought about him, and the public, predictably, chose to emphasize the parts that fit the legend: the fearlessness, the quick draw, the defiance of corrupt Reconstruction authority. The part about the sleeping man got less airplay. The number of men Hardin killed is a subject of considerable historical debate, and the debate itself is instructive. At the high end, claims from his own era put the number at around 40. Hardin himself suggested around 40 as well. Modern historians, working from documented cases, verified killings, and careful analysis of court records and newspaper reports, tend to settle on a lower number. Somewhere between 20 and 27 is the range most serious historians work within. That is still a staggering number. That is more people than most wars ask of individual soldiers. That is a man who killed someone on average every few months across the most active years of his violence. And most of those killings were not in battle. They were personal. They were the result of the specific intersection of a hair-trigger temper, a profound inability to accept any diminishment of his sense of self, and the near-constant availability of a loaded firearm. Texas in the 1870s was not a peaceable place. Violence was common. The law was inconsistent and often absent. Men died in arguments that today would end with someone blocking someone else on their phone. But even within that context, Hardin stands out. Not because the world around him was peaceful, because it was not, and he still managed to be the most dangerous thing in it. There is a question that any serious accounting of John Wesley Hardin has to try to answer. The question is whether he was a product of his time and place, or whether there was something in him specifically that would have made him dangerous in any era. The honest answer is probably both, and the proportions are impossible to calculate precisely. The Civil War and its aftermath created conditions in which violence was normalized, in which young men of the Southern white class were taught from childhood that armed resistance to perceived injustice was not just acceptable, but admirable. Reconstruction specifically created a situation in which the legal system was, from the Southern perspective, an instrument of humiliation rather than justice, and in which a generation of young men decided that their own judgment was more reliable than any court's verdict. John Hardin was shaped by all of that. He was a product of that world in a way that is historically real and does not require excusing anything he did. But he was also clearly operating at an extreme that the world which shaped him did not fully require. Other men grew up in the same conditions. Other men lost relatives in the Civil War. Other men had complicated encounters with Reconstruction justice. They did not all kill dozens of people. The something extra in Hardin, the quality that elevated him from a product of his environment into something history could not ignore, was the thing that made him walk down that hotel hallway in the dark and kill a sleeping man over a noise. It was the quality that made him unable to experience any friction without reaching immediately for the most permanent possible solution. It was not just fearlessness. It was a specific kind of moral architecture in which other people's existence only registered as a problem or a tool, and problems got solved in the most direct way available. That is not a quality produced entirely by the Civil War and Reconstruction. That is something that came with him, and that the world then armed and pointed in a direction and called heroic because the mythology of the frontier needed heroes, even when the available material was something considerably darker. The Texas he grew up in no longer exists. The frontier closed. The cattle drives stopped. The lawless decades gave way to something that at least resembled order. The men who had lived by the gun either adapted or died, and most of them died before they had the chance to adapt. Hardin was unusual in that he survived long enough to adapt in his fashion, to put on the suit of the lawyer and the vocabulary of the courtroom, and try to make himself fit into the new world that had replaced the one he understood. He did not quite succeed. The legal career was real but modest. The drinking got worse. The gambling got worse. And in the end, he stood at a bar with his back to the door, and John Selman walked in and removed from the world something that the world had been trying to remove for a long time. The legend was immediate. In El Paso and across Texas, and eventually across the whole country, the story of John Wesley Hardin was packaged and sold as the story of the greatest gunfighter who ever lived. The number of his killings was inflated. The justifications were amplified. The sleeping man in the hotel room was quietly moved to the margins. And the preacher's son, who had carried his grandfather's name into a life of spectacular violence, became, over the decades, something as polished and misleading as a dime novel cover. The darkness got filed smooth. The bodies got abstracted into numbers. The specific horror of what it actually meant to be the person who killed a sleeping stranger over noise got softened into a story about the wild frontier and the men who lived by different rules. Different rules. That is the phrase the mythology reaches for when it cannot quite bring itself to say what it actually means. What it means is this: there were men in that era who decided that their own desires and their own code were more important than the existence of other people. And the mythology of the frontier celebrated them for it, because the mythology needed heroes, and the heroes available were often men of that description, and it was easier to call them legends than to sit with what they actually were. John Wesley Hardin was the most extreme version of that type, and the fact that his story has been told and retold and filmed and written about for more than a century and a half, and that people still argue about whether he was a hero or a villain, tells you something uncomfortable about the culture that cannot stop telling it. Because the ambivalence is not really about Hardin. It is about the values that produced him. The man who sleeps in the hotel room and never wakes up deserves more than to be a footnote in someone else's legend. He was a person. He had a life. He had, presumably, plans for the next morning. And because John Wesley Hardin found him inconvenient, those plans ended forever in the dark. That is not the story the legend tells. That is the story underneath the legend. And that is the one worth remembering. Thanks for watching. If this kind of deep dive into the true stories that the myth machine grinds down is what you are here for, subscribe and leave a comment telling me which part of this story you had never heard before. I will see you in the next one.